name is Jerome Lim, Alumni Community Manager here at Melbourne Business School. I am also an MBA alumni myself, graduated last year, class of 2025. So welcome to Alumni Evenings. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Melbourne Business School is on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and acknowledge their connection to land, sea, and community, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So tonight is Alumni Evenings with Jamie Cross. So it's a very timely topic. War, oil shocks, and trade restrictions, macroeconomic and policy implications for Australia. If you've been following the news today, every day really, like you might have seen that this fresh conflicts, oil prices have risen again today. So Jamie will be here to talk to us about that. We also have a group of alumni panelists who I'll introduce shortly to talk about these things and how it's impacting things like the price we pay every day for food or fuel and things like that. Before we begin, maybe I'd like to, I'd also like to welcome the people joining us online. I see there's about 30 people dialed in. Thank you very much for taking the time. And thank you for those of you in the room who are here. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of our Dean, Professor Jenny George, who is here with us today. Thank you so much. And so today's proceedings will have a keynote speech presentation by Professor Jamie Cross. And that'll be followed by that's 30 minutes, and that'll be followed by a 30-minute panel discussion with our esteemed panel of MBS alums who work in the industry. And then there'll be a Q&A. So just raise your hands if you have a question at the end. For those of you online, just type your questions in the chat, and I will read it out and raise my hands, just like in class. And so before we begin, I'd like to test your knowledge of how well you know Professor Jamie Cross. So go to Slido.com. And we'll play a little game, 2 truths and a lie. Right, Slido.com and type in cross-check. Right, so 2 truths and a lie. Before becoming an economics professor, Jamie Cross was a bodybuilder, a bricklayer, and a chess coach. One of these is not true. So which one is it? Is it bricklayer, bodybuilder, or chess coach? So we'll just see the results come in, and then I will reveal the answer. Right, votes still coming in strong. Oh, wow, okay. So, all right, so are you ready to hear this? So, the answer is, I think the crowd's got it correct, actually. Professor Jamie Cross was not a chess coach. He was a champion powerlifter back in university, and he had also competed in bodybuilding shortly after that. He had also apprenticed as a bricklayer or stonemason back in his younger days. And so it just goes to show like the amount of like talent that our faculty and our community have, which is very exciting here for us at MBS. So, but apart from that, Jamie, yeah. 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 So Jamie Cross completed his PhD at the Australian National University in 2017. He's since held positions at the ANU, BI Norwegian Business School, and the University of Queensland. Jamie's research focuses on applying and developing econometric models to understand things like business cycles, inflation, and policy effectiveness, so macroeconomic stuff. He's also taught courses in econometrics, so I understand that's a subset of economics that uses a lot of statistics and regression modeling and hypothesis testing, so very fun stuff that we all learn in DA, data analysis. And he's taught mathematics at all levels from undergraduate to PhD level. He currently teaches data analysis here at Melbourne Business School to the MBA program, predictive analytics for the Master of Business Analytics program. One project that he's worked on outside of academia was used by the Australian Automobile Association in policy discussions. And that led to the establishment of a National Office for Road Safety in 2019. So just goes to show how some of the research that's done here really has, that our faculty is doing has real world implications. So without further ado, I would invite Jamie Cross to come up on stage. So please welcome Professor Jamie Cross.
Thank you. So I'll make two quick corrections. Number one, I'm an associate professor. Still working towards the professor promotion, but thanks anyway. And number two, Jerome asked for kind of two truths and a lie early on. Is there a bit of feedback going on? Yeah, two truths and a lie early on. And I did tell him that number one, I did some bodybuilding, and number two, I was an apprentice stonemason back in the day. But what he didn't know is I was actually also a chess coach. So it turns out they're all true. It was a trick question. And yeah, so long story short, when I was younger, I broke my ankle playing sports. I needed to take some time off, got thrown into the world of chess, met my then chess coach at a local chess club, and then became a chess coach because it was a much better way to make money than washing dishes at the local pub, right? So that was great. So I did that for a few years. And for those who are in the chess world, I'm not that good. I only got to about 1900 FIDE, but it's reasonably good. Good enough to coach some kids, right? But anyway, so today we'll talk about war, oil, and trade restrictions, as Jerome said, and we'll really focus on, even though these are global events, the implication of these events for Australia. And I'm much more excited to hear from our panelists today than I am to hear from myself. So we have three great specialists here through Pina, Hiti, and Michael, who Jerome will introduce in much more detail later on. So let's just kind of cast our minds back to earlier this year, and if this wants to work, whoops, which it doesn't, I'll see if I can point. But if we just focus in on the top left, then we'll see up here, it's a map of the Middle East and the Gulf, and there's this little circle that is present, which most of you probably know what that is by now because it's become somewhat infamous, which is this Strait of Hormuz. So from memory, this is a strait which goes from Oman up until Iran, where you can see there. It's about 170 kilometers wide. But what people, well, you might know because of what's been reported, there are a lot of commodities that transit through this Gulf, and it really connects all of these Gulf countries with the rest of the world. So we have, for example, 1/5 of the world's oil supply that currently passes through there. We have about half of the world's supply of sulfur, which is a key input into fertilizer, which is my understanding, and Hiti can tell us much more about that later on. We also have about 1/3 of methanol and helium, and I learned that helium is not only for balloons and making our voices squeaky, but it's also a key input into things in medicine like MRI machines, which I didn't know about before. And it's also used in the production of chips, which is helping fuel our AI boom around the world. So this, extends not only to oil, but to other commodities, which are very important. And one fact that people might not know is that even though this strait is about 170 kilometers wide, it's very, very shallow. And only 3 kilometers of that strait can be used for these ships to transit through. I hope I've got my facts right. Yeah. So basically what that means is if someone wants to put a blockade in for whatever reason, it's pretty easy to do. 3 kilometers is not very far, right? You could walk that in about 30 minutes. You could clearly see from one side to another. And if you just place a couple of mines across it, you've basically said no one's allowed to go through that region anymore. And this is not something that's new. In fact, people have known this for at least 600 years. So when I was doing some reading, you read back and you see that the Portuguese once realized that a lot of the world's spices came from this region. And rather than going and conquering that region, they realized all you need to do is control the strait. You control the strait, you control the trade, you can collect the gold, right? And then the Brits realized that with the East India Company, they came along, kicked out the Portuguese, and then we get to the modern day, where on the 28th of February, US and Israel decided to launch Operation Epic Fury on Iran for reasons that at least were stated to be nothing to do with this particular Gulf. But the US has turned out to be a pretty big net beneficiary from the region, so you can take what you will from that. And as we'll see, there are major issues for that for the rest of the world. So about 80% of Asia's, as you can see from this map up here on the top right, fuel supply, oil supply, I should say, literally comes from this strait. And when the missiles started to strike, we see a dramatic drop. On average, about 129 ships pass through this strait, after which only 6 pass through this strait. And most of those are through Iranian waters from China. So there's been massive, massive decline. And a big part of the reason for this is not only because of this war, it's because the insurance companies said there's a war going on. We're no longer insuring ships going through that channel. So if you want to take on $100 to $250 million gamble as to whether your ship will get through there safely, that is up to you. We'll circle back to that because it's going to be, I think, an under-talked about point in this war, but probably from what the rest of us know, this has had direct implications for oil prices. They've skyrocketed. They've somewhat plateaued since, but as we'll see later on, I think it's a bit artificial. So basically what I want to spend most of the time talking about is the macroeconomic transmission of what we call these shocks, these events that have taken place into Australia, right? And I'll break it down into 4 components. Number 1, we'll look at energy and fuel, which we're probably all familiar with. We'll have a look at that, how that transmits into prices and activity through the value chain, of which we have experts here. We'll then talk a little bit about my research, which is to do with expectations and uncertainty and how that can have very real effects, and also the policy implications and what can and can't be done, why the RBA is jacking up these interest rates and making us all pay more money on our mortgages, and what fiscal policy can actually do to try and fix this. All right, so channel 1. Often when people think about oil prices, their mind goes to energy. And this is true for a lot of countries around the world. It's not so important for Australia. So if we have a quick look up here in the top left, you'll see that the total primary energy mix for all uses of energy around Australia is actually predominantly fueled by oil. And that's why early on, we saw a lot of these headlines which were saying that the war in the Middle East is going to have catastrophic impacts on Australian energy markets. But then, definitions matter. If you look a little bit closer into the actual electricity generation mix, then oil is very small. It's pretty much down the bottom. Will this work? Maybe. That's oil, right? We can see there's been a big reduction in coal over the past couple of decades, and we're seeing this massive increase in renewables. So the main channel through which this transmits is not electricity. We can see from the bottom figure that the main channel is actually transport, right? And then industry, from which we have some experts here, and shipping make up the bulk. Less than 1% of Australia's electricity mix is actually coming from oil itself. So then this raises a key question. If oil is used in fuel for logistical reasons, then where does Australia's fuel actually come from, right? It's a natural question that you might be wondering. And you've probably seen this on the news as well, which is that in the early 2000s, Australia was pretty much self-sufficient. We were able to take in oil and refine it more or less fully domestically. And then due to the creation of these so-called massive, what's the word I'm looking for? Massive, efficient refineries that were built throughout Asia, companies within Australia quickly discovered that it was no longer economically efficient to keep operating those refineries within Australia. It's actually cheaper to let the refining happen in Asia and import it in, right? So from an economic efficiency argument, that makes sense. We don't need these refineries anymore. Let's shut them down. So we've closed 6 of 8 of those refineries. And then over time, as we can see in 2025, so this is a couple months before the war in the Middle East started, Australia was 80% reliant on imports to get total fuel. So the only two refineries we have left are in Geelong and I believe it's Lytton, although I'm not from Queensland, so correct me if I'm wrong with the pronunciation, right? One thing that people might not know, and this is something that I've certainly learned over the past year, and I know Hitzi's an expert in, is that 3 of the major fertiliser plants within Australia have also closed since 2019, and this hasn't made much news, probably because people were preoccupied with the pandemic that was going on and other things. But this, to me at least, is one of the major issues because 85% of our fertiliser is now imported, 60% of which came from the Middle East. So this is a massive shock, which will have effects over the next year, as we'll see. So for these reasons, some people in the media have come up with this term, which I quite like. It's called Diesel Nation, when they refer to Australia. And we can see from these charts again, I'm a stats guy, I love charts. I hope it's not overkill for people. But up in the top, a fun fact that you might want to leave tonight with is that Australia is the world's largest consumption per capita country of anywhere in the world. So we use the most diesel per person. That's what that means, which to me at least was pretty surprising because when I think of kind of car usage, I think US for whatever reason, that's what comes to my mind. But Australia blows that out of the water. And then when you think about it, it's like, yeah, we have a really big country. We need to get things around the country through supply chains, right? We need trucks, we need ships. It's no wonder that we actually consume a lot of diesel. We're also the #1 importer of diesel as well. And most of that is used through the transportation, mining, and agricultural sectors. And that's why, as we all know, earlier this year, after the war broke out, when we went to fill up at the Bowser, we started paying a lot more money for fuel. It's not only diesel, right? It's also unleaded as well. We see this massive spike that has occurred here. We saw pretty much a run on the Bowser, if you would call it that, where people were taking big tanks and trying to fill them up. Anthony Albanese and others came out and said, please don't do that. It's not COVID, right? We're not going to run out of toilet paper. We have plenty of fuel. They said we have about a month's supply at that stage from memory, and that's something we'll come back to. I said that this has declined, as you can see, in recent periods, but we know that this is somewhat artificial. It's artificial for a couple of reasons. Number one, if we look at the actual cost mix, then we can see that a big proportion of this in the green there is taxes. And what's happened in recent periods? That's been halved, right? So you can add another 26 cents per litre to a lot of this to get something that's a bit more realistic. And another thing that we'll also see is that the International Energy Agency released the largest quantity of strategic petroleum reserves in history to try and get that price down. And that's a short-term fix, right? There are some solutions that are being proposed, most of which people won't like, but we'll get to those in a bit. So it's not only fuel where we all feel this pinch, it's because fuel impacts the whole value chain, of which we have some experts here, and Pina will hopefully tell us a bit about farming a bit later on. So if we start from the front end, which Michael's an expert in, well, we need to have oil from somewhere. How do we get it? We import it. When we import it, then that's going to add to freight charges. It's also going to go to farmers to be able to produce crops. It's going to impact all types of vehicles and everything that's going to be used within the farming process. They then load up food, for example, onto the back of cold trucks so that perishable goods don't disintegrate, right? They don't go bad in a short amount of time. And that's the cold chain. So again, this requires energy, packaging. Well, petrol is used in plastics and other products. When I was overseas earlier this year, they were telling me that medical costs are skyrocketing in some countries throughout Southeast Asia because of plastics, right? So anyway, and then of course that needs to be taken to the supermarkets where we buy the food from, and then that will add a retail price on top of that. So this is sometimes what we call the inflation pass-through of an oil price shock, where we start with something on the left-hand side, it goes up the value chain and eventually results into higher prices for all of us in not only food, but other goods and services. So as an economist, we like to keep things simple. And if you've taken managerial economics here, which I'm sure most of you have since you're alum, then you'll probably have seen a demand and supply diagram that looks something like this. And because we're in macro, we call it an aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, or ADAS for shorts. And basically what this says is, well, if we start at A with some equilibrium, price and quantity, in this case, we have price, we can think of that as inflation, and quantity as total GDP, for example, then we get this shock, commodity price shock, as we just saw, is going to increase the price of goods and services generally. It's also going to push down the quantity of those things that are available. And we get what's called a stagflationary environment, which is every policymaker's worst nightmare. You know? Part of the reason it's the policymaker's worst nightmare is because a lot of our policy objectives, even if you date back to the work of Keynes in the early 1900s, have been about managing demand side. And we'll see later on that monetary policy is fundamentally a demand side policy. Most fiscal policies are fundamentally demand side policies. How do you fix a supply side problem? Well, you have to fix the supply side problem. That's the only way you can actually do it. You can't just help people and then expect things to get better, okay? So there are real trade-offs that we're going to see when we get into the policy space. So this is not just a theoretical situation. If we look here, then we can see that inflation has started to tick up, as everyone is well aware of, and we've seen interest rates rise as a result. One thing that might be a little bit surprising is that output is also growing, although at a much slower rate than is expected. And that's partly, and I don't want to say this is the full story, but it's partly because Australia is a lucky country, as I'm sure we've all heard before. We're the major beneficiaries of exporting other commodities, and even though the resource boom is certainly over, as we can see here, it's plateaued over the past decade or so, we're still benefiting somewhat from higher LNG prices, but primarily up from the top there, you can see stronger exchange rates and higher terms of trade, which means that we basically get more money for our exports than we do for our imports, and we benefit from that. I'll give some perspective, because I know people are hurting, I'm hurting, but it is worse if you go out there into the world. Within a month of the war in the Middle East, Philippines declared a state of national emergency. They had power outages. They had people lining up to get fuel because of fuel shortages. They've had increases in inflation. They've also had underemployment at a 3-year high. And this is because 98%, as you can see there, of their oil, 97% of gas, which is used in energy creation there, comes from that region. So that's just got cut off overnight. So within a month, they're not doing so well. And we can see that other countries around the world are also facing similar challenges. You know, if we look here, Japan has seen a spike in food prices, staples like rice doubling. So, you know, what was once just a problem of oil not being able to pass through a strait in the Middle East has turned to some people not being able to drive, some people not being able to eat. So these effects are very real. I think one area that doesn't get near enough attention is actually, what about the Gulf countries themselves, right? They've been completely cut off, yeah? So if we think about some of those countries from that initial slide, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, etc., well, these countries have now lost all access to tourism. Most of their food supplies came through the straits, and they're reliant primarily on desalination plants for water. And the major threat is, if you get involved in this war, we'll just strike out those desal plants, right? It's not a good situation for anyone to be in, yeah? Okay. So part of my research is not only looking at the effects of physical supply shocks and their economic effects, as you can see on the top, but also looking at uncertainty that is associated with these types of massive disruptions and those type of flow-on effects. And that can be very important because uncertainty can hit even without any changes in supply, right? And those effects can be very real. In fact, typically what we'll see when people are talking, like OPEC releases some kind of news, Even if the government comes out, they describe some kind of new policy, there'll be a lot of uncertainty associated with that, and people will just act in order to hedge themselves against that in the future. And uncertainty can drive the business cycle. So I really love this quote, which you might leave here with, which is from Olivier Blanchard, a very well-known economist in the US. So he says, given uncertainty, why build a new plant, introduce a new product, better to pause until the smoke clears. And I'm sure that's something that all of you can relate to in today's business environment, even here within Australia. There's a lot of uncertainty that's going on. People, businesses, I should say, have made layoffs. We have an AI boom. There's a lot of uncertainty about how that's going to take place. How long is this war actually going to hold out for, etc. So this is a classic real options channel. I've also done a bit of work on precautionary savings, which simply say, well, even as households, I'm sure if we look around, people start to build buffer stocks of savings, right? Because you want to hedge against the future. If we do end up in a recession next year, I want to make sure that I'm in a position where I can kind of smooth myself over that particular period of time. I don't want to have to default on my mortgage, right? Anyway. So we don't have to look too far to see the impacts of this. So if I pull up consumer sentiment index, we can see here it's currently at a pretty much 2-decade low within Australia. And you just have to open the newspaper to kind of see the effects that are happening through uncertainty around the country. A couple of Fin Review articles there talking about fuel shortages and driving up the prices of food, as well as electricity prices, although I think that one's probably a bit overstated, and recession risk, which is a very real possibility over the next 12 months. So what can the government do about it, right? The government's job is basically to look at all of this uncertainty, look at these negative shocks that we're all being hit with, and try and come up with a plan that can steer us on a better course for the future, right? We don't want to run off a cliff. But as I said before, part of the challenge with this type of environment is that especially in the monetary policy arena, the RBA only sets the cash rate. So they have a demand side policy, which is ultimately to change interest rates. And on the fiscal side, they can do a lot, as we'll see. They can, lower taxes temporarily. They can provide some subsidies, but they can give some transfers, but these are short-term fixes, right? They can't keep these things on indefinitely. So really it comes down to these supply side type deals, and these are questions that I'm going to pose to our great panel about what's actually being done in this space on the ground, right? So I'll give some overview. There are other international government agencies that also can kick in and help. Like I said, the IEA has released the world's largest of emergency oil reserves, but they're dwindling. We'll see. Actually, I took it out, but the US strategic petroleum reserves are currently at the lowest they've ever been since 1983. So you might know that in the 1970s, we had an energy crisis, not too dissimilar from this one, due to wars in the Middle East. In particular, Iraq was at war with Iran, and then people in OPEC were kind of misbehaving. So the Saudis came in and said, okay, if you're not going to meet your quotas, then no one will. And it was a bit of a mess, right? After that, people established these reserves, yeah? Unfortunately, as we'll see, not everyone has played along, but they're also just a finite resource. We can't depend on them too much. So what can monetary policy do? Well, as I said before, the RBA's job, and I hope if you are from the RBA, you'll forgive me for just giving it this briefly, but their job, more or less, is to keep inflation within a 2 to 3% range over the medium term. They do a lot more stuff, financial stability and everything else, but I'm simplifying here, right? And how do they do that? Well, they change the cash rate. They change the interest rates, which for us kind of feels like an unfair thing for them to do, because it just means that we'll be forking out more of our paychecks into our mortgages, mostly speaking, probably given the audience in this room. But there are other channels through which this operates. It's obviously going to impact the cost of borrowing in firms and also in households. And the RBA does this to meet what I call the Goldilocks zone, right? So, on the one hand, if inflation is too high for too long, right, things are running a bit too hot, then they're going to have to increase the cash rate to try and reduce the economic activity and bring down inflation. It's a classic demand side story. If the porridge is too cold, right? Then we're on this side where they're reducing the cash rate. They're trying to heat it up. They're trying to get more spending flowing. And then if the porridge is just right, you can eat. Yeah, they're not going to change anything within the cash rate and the economy, generally speaking. So we can put that on our figure. So previously we were at this equilibrium B, and now the RBA's come in and they've said, well, inflation's going to be too high for too long. So what we're going to do is increase the cash rate, and that's going to cause a monetary contraction, which pushes us down to this new equilibrium in C, which, if I drew the P's, you would see actually brings the price down. But what's the cost? The cost is that this comes at an even lower output, right? So that's why when you read the news, a lot of the time they'll say that Michelle Bullock and others at the RBA are walking this fine line between pushing Australia into an economic recession and keeping stable inflation. So you might even think, well, why do they do that? Why not just let inflation run free, right? Surely that's going to be better for society than me herding through these cash rate changes. And evidence or history has shown that that's just actually not the case, right? So why do we actually have this 2 to 3% target? This is a target range which is deemed to be an acceptable rate of economic growth, roughly speaking, that will translate to, there's this one fun fact called the rule of 70. I don't have a pen on me, but if you went 70 divided by the growth rate, it would take approximately that much time for something to double in size. So at 2% inflation, 70 divided by 2, it would take about 35 years for prices to double. And if prices doubled every 35 years, we'd probably be happy. Yeah, so that's what they're trying to achieve through that lower bound. Now, what happens if prices were 7% or 10%? Well, if they're 10%, as they were in this post-pandemic inflation surge, then they're essentially doubling every 7 years. Now we're not so happy. All right. In some parts of the world, prices have doubled since February. They're really not happy. Right? Okay. What about fiscal policy? Can we do anything better here? Well, we can. We can start to provide targeted relief, especially to those vulnerable households that need it. So we don't have to impose blanket tax reductions, blanket subsidies. We can actually target industries. We can do a lot of things. We can also strengthen fuel security, which is something that's happening, and invest in supply chain resilience, which is also something that's happening. But as we'll potentially hear later on, these things might take time. Right? And in the short run, it's going to still have an effect. Unfortunately, the government doesn't have a magic wand. They cannot control global oil prices. It's completely out of their control. We saw in the media today that new strikes have occurred, even though there were talks of peace deals not so long ago. So we would expect maybe for this to run for a bit longer than expected. They also can't fully offset any of these trade-offs that we've talked about. So what have they done? Well, on the demand side, we know that they've cut the fuel excise. They've done temporary, just complete eliminations of other taxes, for example, on heavy road usage, which is good for logistics companies, and also on ag for the next 12 months. On the supply side, they've pledged $15 billion approximately to try and create fuel resistance for Australia. So about half of that is going on fuel and fertiliser facilities, which, as we saw, were just eliminated. So this is kind of undoing some of the actions over the past, 6 years to 20 years, right? They're also pledging quite a chunk of money, $3.2 billion in a fuel security reserve, which is about 1 billion litres of diesel and jet fuel, which is something that Michael might be able to tell us more about, although I don't want to push people in directions that they certainly can't talk about. And they've also invested in trying to get Australia off of fossil fuels, as we all know, into cleaner alternatives. Okay. So the macroeconomics of fiscal policy, we can see here, number one is that, well, previously we saw monetary policy pushes us this way on the diagram. Fiscal stimulus on the demand side pushes us that way. So this comes with the idea of trying to offset this output collapse, right? That's the whole goal there. But usually what happens is it just leads to higher inflation. And even if they come in and just said, well, you know what, let's just put price caps on all of these things. So we want to get rid of that inflation. Then what would happen? Well, we get non-price rationing, which is essentially people lining up halfway around the block in order to get their fuel. As soon as the service station runs out of fuel, you're out of luck. Go to the next one. And we saw some of that unfolding earlier this year. I remember one time when I went to fill up, no petrol, right? That particular station was out. My stepdad works in a service station. He was out of work for a couple of weeks out of the month because they literally just didn't have the supply chains to get there and refill the tanks. So the better policy, if we can have it, is to push this supply curve back to where it was. That would offset everything, but this is somewhat limited in what the government can do because we can't just go out and get more oil. Right? We can't just go out and get more fuel. That's why Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong earlier this year were in Southeast Asia, striking a lot of these trade deals with places like Korea, Singapore, and Malaysia, which is where we get most of this oil from. Okay. So what's the outlook? It's been a bit of a pessimistic talk, right? When I was talking to one of our people in marketing, Bree, who's great, she helps me with a lot of these comms. She says, Jamie, this is really depressing. Do we have a more positive outlook? I'm sorry, right? It's the best I can offer. So what does the RBA say? Just to let you know that it's not fully coming from me, yeah? So this is the RBA's forecast from their most recent statement of monetary policy. And they basically give this baseline, which is here in the kind of pink. They then give an adverse scenario, which is in green, and another adverse scenario, which is here in orange. And the baseline scenario was that Hormuz would reopen, right? And most central banks have pretty similar forecasts. So this is not just unique to the RBA, I should say. So their idea was that the war would end and Hormuz would be fully open by the end of the year. Yeah, this was the best case scenario. And under this scenario, we can see that they would say, well, inflation will kind of peak and then get back within the target range, and unemployment would go up by a bit. Yeah, and remember they have to accept that trade-off in order to be able to meet their inflation targets. So what are the adverse scenarios? Well, adverse scenario one is that there's a little bit of an extended situation that's happening in the Middle East. This is only to Q1 27, so it's not looking so far away, right? And under that scenario, we can see that inflation would be higher because of some stickiness, and unemployment would be higher. And then essentially what they do is they have an even worse scenario where unemployment would be up around 5.1%. So regardless of where you look, best case scenario, we're kind of headed for a little bit of a dip. Worst case scenario, we're headed for a pretty big increase in unemployment, which is typically associated with a reduction in output. But I think there are two under-discussed risks, and this is what I'm more excited to learn about from our panel, if I'm being honest, which is, well, number one, even if the war magically stopped today, right, which would be great, everyone would be happy, it doesn't just go back to business as usual, right? And that's because the Strait, as I said before, was actually littered with mines throughout this whole process, right? So the Pentagon has estimated that it would take about 6 months to clear the Straits of mines. And as I also mentioned earlier, the insurance companies probably will not reinstate that insurance on a $100 to a $250 million tanker until that's cleared, right? So there are really unknown delays, yeah, in terms of how long this would take, 6 months, 12 months, who knows? In terms of fertilizer shortages, which is the one I'm probably most concerned about, if I'm being honest, then, fertilizer, we can see from over here, fertilizer prices have skyrocketed. They're the highest they've been since the Russia-Ukraine war. And the UN has also come out and warned that there's a very real chance of food crises within the next 12 months. So I hope the government's thinking about this. They've pledged some money, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our panel. One thing that I should have said before I'll get the panel up here is that part of the reason we're also in this challenging situation, as Michael would know all too well, is that I hope I didn't cut this out. Yeah, here, I should have said, Australia is part of this International Energy Agency. So part of this is that it requires the member countries to maintain at least 90 days of net oil, right, in accordance with their rules. But Australia hasn't met this since 2012, right? We've usually had 30, 40 days throughout this period, is my understanding, which is part of the reason we can't smooth a lot of these effects out, like China, for example, if you follow what's happening there. They have the 90 days. They also accept oil from Russia, which they're now passing on to Southeast Asia, and we obviously get that through trade. So even though we have embargoes, we do actually get through the process Russian oil. Okay. Hope it's not too depressing. I feel like I needed some more fun in that. But anyway, I'm really excited. We don't have images. Do we have images? No. Let's flick back to the start. We did. Something happened. Yeah, we'll see them now. Anyway, I'm very excited to hear from our guests. So I'll let Jerome do the formal introductions. There we go.
So I will invite our panel members on stage, and I'll introduce them. So first, we have Pina Palumbieri, Chief Operating Officer at Dairy Australia. Pina joined Dairy Australia in 2023 and became Chief Operating Officer earlier this year. She brings more than 20 years of leadership experience across retail, food manufacturing, and the broader supply chain. Before that, she held senior strategy roles and transformation roles at Coles Online, Kraft Heinz, PZ Cussons, and General Mills. She's also an MBS alum, Executive MBA 2018, and received the Dean's Award for Global Business Economics. She's spoken about how the MBA has helped her lead complex organizational change during the COVID-19 pandemic. The next panelist is Michael Baker, General Manager of Australia and New Zealand Midstream Infrastructure at BP. He has more than 20 years of experience across the energy industry and has held leadership roles in ExxonMobil, Gemini, and BP, working across upstream, midstream, and downstream operations. His expertise spans engineering, operations, supply and strategy, including emerging areas such as biomethane production. He's known for bringing together technical and commercial thinking to deliver practical and sustainable infrastructure solutions. He completed his part-time MBA in 2014. And then finally, Hiti Taluja. Hiti is a commodities trading and supply chain strategist with more than 20 years of international experience in trade, bulk shipping, and procurement. She was Chief Commercial Officer at ASX-listed Centrex Limited and Regional Manager at the global commodity trader Tremo. She can give us a unique perspective on how oil price shocks and supply chain disruptions affect freight and fertilizer and food production. She's also a fellow of the Chartered Shipbrokers in London and now works as a consultant to fertilizer and chemical companies in the region. And she completed her executive MBA alongside Pina in 2018. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give the panel a warm round of applause.
Seats. Make some space. This one. Oops. Okay. So, who wants to go first and give a more positive spin? No. I'm extremely excited to hear what each of the panelists have to say. So, if you don't mind, Hiti, I'll kick things off with you. Yeah. And because fertilizer is something that, as I mentioned at the end, I'm quite concerned about, but I don't hear any discussion of this in the Australia media. I do hear discussions of this in the international media, and especially if I look at places like the UN and the IMF and et cetera. So what are the implications of this for Australia specifically, as opposed to the world in general? And, is there a bit too much hype in the talk, or does it have some grounding in reality?
Yep. I don't think it's a hype, there is a compounded structural changes which has happened in Australia. The first important one is since 2019, which you also mentioned in your slide, is closure of three major fertilizer plants in Australia. And one was doing urea and ammonium sulfate. The two were the SSP, which is single superphosphate, very much required for the pasture industry here. So after those closure of that plants, what has happened is we are importing fertilizer into Australia. But obviously, it all compounded when Straits of Hormuz got, we could not bring product from there, where I would say Australia imports close to 1 million ton of urea, out of which I would say 80% of that urea comes from those Gulf region. And the reason is the supply concentration, because the grass prices are so low in that region as compared to here. That is the reason it's cheap to buy product from there. And that's where if you see just recently, you would have seen that the Australian government actually subsidized three main companies to bring urea at a subsidized rate. So they are going to provide some subsidies to these companies so that the prices can be stable. So I definitely don't see hype. We might not see price increase in our food cycles now, but when the new application season comes in, that's where all those inputs will go. So currently the food or the crop which we are enjoying right now is based on the prices from the previous application where correct. Yeah. So we will see in probably next 2 season that the prices hike will go up. The real price hike recently has only gone up because of the fuel increased prices, not actually the input costs. But we will feel that in next 6 to 12 months for sure.
Okay. And then I might just pass on to you, Pina, and build off of that, if it's okay with you, in relation to the dairy industry, in talking about the direct impacts of fertiliser prices and oil prices more generally, if we're only seeing those priced in at the moment and not yet the fertiliser prices.
Yeah, Heidi's absolutely right about that in terms of the outlook. I mean, so we start with the positive. You wanted some optimism. Sure. We've had a lot of rain, so everybody's really happy about that. It's been a really good autumn for particularly the southern dairying regions of Australia in, Tasmania and Southwest Vic and northern Victoria. But to Heidi's point in terms of seasonality, urea supply into the spring will be critical to just ensuring that pasture levels reach, optimised and in an affordable way for farmers so that they're not absorbing additional costs as, at the start of the food supply chain, because then that could be quite, problematic going forward into the future seasons, as Heidi pointed out. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask, so I'm a bit of an amateur when it comes to exactly how the fertiliser prices are used. Urea, which industries is primarily impacted?
So plants need, just in a layman's language, plant needs three nutrients. N, nitrogen, which comes from urea. P is phosphate, which is your MAP, DAP, those kind, SSP. So phosphate builds all the bones of the plants and also helps with the animal bone building as well. And then K is mostly the potash, But we're not that much impacted with regards to potash because most of the potash for Australia and New Zealand comes from Canada and US. So that's not, but having said that, potash only beautifies the animals or the plants, but the main two ingredients are your nitrogen and phosphate. So, I have seen that. So apart from that, there are also other based apart from urea, which provides nitrogen, to the plants.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I didn't know that. But I hope that's also shed some light. So if I switch gears a little bit, Michael, and I understand, you might be restricted with or you can and can't say. One thing that I was very shocked to learn about earlier this year was that Australia has kind of under-hit its targets of this 90-day requirement. And it probably came as a shock to many people around with having these 30 to, 40 days potentially. So do you know much about that? Can you talk much about that?
Yeah. Share some thoughts.
Yeah, please. Switch it up.
Thanks very much. Yeah, you mentioned the IEA have a target of 90 days, and Australia's been hovering around that 30 days across all the different grades, diesel, jet, and gasoline. And you know, your questions leading to the why. Why can't we have more, and why are we hovering around this? I think it comes down to a few factors. One is risk. You know, the world's changing. These crises didn't happen in 2012 earlier, and the government was rolling the dice that they won't happen. So we're going to hover around that 30-day mark and make that decision. Building more infrastructure is very capital intensive, and these tanks just don't sprout out of the ground, even as urea was in there helping to grow. But no, they take 2.5 years to build a tank, so there's quite a bit of a lead time on those. I think the other thing is the industry pre-Middle East crisis, it was all about efficiency and optimization. So it was about having stable, balanced supply chains. Now, post that, it's all about resilience. And so that's why the conversation is now moving to, okay, we do need to invest some money and build that resilience and start moving away from an efficiency optimized mindset.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the economist in me loves the just-in-time inventory system, right? Loves efficiency, but I can completely understand in other times it's better to have some kind of plan for stability, right? With definitely within the outlook. So in terms of what Australia currently has, is there anything that you think, and it's coming just from a personal perspective, I suppose, could be done to strengthen that resilience within the petroleum sector in general?
Yeah, I think it can be broken down into two areas. One is the supply chains offshore and how do we get it here? And previously, there was a very stable supply chain. You mentioned the refineries in Asia supplying Australia. Moving forward, how do we grow the resilience there? It's a very interconnected world. We've now established new supply chains post the Middle East crisis. So how do we strengthen those and make sure we've got diverse supply chains coming into the country? And then the second area is obviously where do you put it?
Yeah.
And so we have tanks and pipes scattered all around the country, and there's an opportunity there to build more, and that goes to the packages that you mentioned and some of the billions of dollars that the government's looking at to provide that storage, ullage and capacity on site to meet those minimum stock obligations of increase the number of days of service.
And what kind of lag are we looking at? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years in terms of building some of these? Because I guess these are massive tanks, right? And the oil needs to be stored within them. They've got to go somewhere, right? You need to construct them.
Yeah, they're pretty agricultural actually. Like you think they're high tech or anything, but it is just a bunch of steel welded together and big tanks. Having said that, though, they still need to be designed correctly. There's a lot of regulations to comply with. And I just mentioned earlier, it's about 2.5 years to build a tank. When you go through the whole design process, development approvals, materials, construction commissioning. Having said that, there'll be a big focus on it. How can we streamline that, get efficiencies? If you're building one tank, build 10 tanks. Right. So there's certainly opportunities there to reduce that lead time.
That makes a lot of sense. And Hiti, if I ask kind of a similar question, but just in the fertiliser sector in general, does Australia even have a national program on that front?
Unfortunately, Australia do not have any reserve program. Okay. So if you see other economies in the world, for example, if you see India, right? India have got their reserves because they're also very dependent into importing fertilizer. But they also provide subsidies to importers to bring in fertilizer, whereas Australia has got no policy whatsoever when it comes to the reserve. And secondly, I think more important for Australia is to keep whatever plants are left, which are very old, right? Keep running them and not close them, subsidize those companies, help them to survive, but then add more capacity. So they are some of the projects which are coming in the market. But unfortunately, with fertilizer or even with microspace as well, a lot of private company, and I've experienced that in some of my past career life, is you want to do some of these big projects, but you don't these days get a resilient investor who's happy to invest in projects wait until 5 years or 4 years, and then they get their return, on their investment. And that's where it is important for government to jump in, to become as an investor, being resilient, to establish those hubs, So not only it will create more domestic capacity in the market, but also I think it will help to build that skill set among the population as well. And one other point which I also want to mention is that government should also target, and you talked about as well in your slide, is give subsidy to target farmers or industry. So not a blanket subsidy, but figure out that which sector of agriculture need that kind of subsidy and provide that to the farmers, so that farmers don't shut their farms, And I'll pass, I think, to Pina to expand more on this. There's so many farmers now shutting down their farms because they are in that myth. I don't know. Do you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly has been a reduction in dairy milk supply from 11 billion litres now to just over 8 billion litres. But, and one of the key things is that farmers and ongoing sustainable, profitability and when we talk about shocks and resilience, how much can the supply chain absorb from a cost shock point of view and for how long? And that's one of the key challenges. But the government has certainly stepped in very, very quickly to collaborate with industry and work through what the demand is, and particularly with regards to regional allocations to make sure that the stocks and supplies were in the right regions and in the right volumes relative to where the ag sector production is. Obviously, there's lots of challenges as you move across the supply chain with the processes needing to move from town to town and cover quite a lot of kilometres and mileage, and that is a unique situation for Australia, which is why you do see the diesel per capita just being so high. And all of that just continues to feed into the overall value chain and the cost implications there, which as an economy and consumers don't really have the capacity to absorb that additional cost.
Yeah, I think everyone's feeling the pinch at the moment, right? Especially coming off the back of the pandemic and the cost of living associated with some of that.
Yeah, most definitely. And from an ag sector perspective, they're very accustomed to responding to shocks to the system, particularly with, with floods and droughts. And now the fertiliser fuel. And so there is a really strong infrastructure in terms of how government and industry work together to respond in the ag sector. But that doesn't necessarily alleviate cost pressures coming through this.
Mm-hmm. So I guess if I throw a question just out in general, since everyone here is an alumni of MBS, and I'm sure leading businesses from the front in terms of management across a variety of industries, what advice would you give to people in that situation about the outlook and how they can navigate kind of a year of uncertainty, if anything? I know it's a challenging question. Do you have any words of wisdom?
Talking about words of wisdom and some words.
Yeah.
We've noticed that the conversation about energy particulars moved from like the operations frontline to the boardroom. It's getting that elevation right now. It's all about moving from that optimization to the resilience piece. I think going forward, what boards and companies and executives need to consider is testing the assumptions that they've used for their risk assessment scenarios. Their business continuity plans, are they correct? The likelihood of these global crises seems to be increasing. We never thought we'd have a pandemic. We've had multiple wars, Ukraine, Middle East, what's around the corner. The frequency seems to be increasing. So by testing the underlying assumptions of your businesses, or if you have risk assessments, business continuity plans, that's probably the first place, and then testing those robustness, because they drive your actions and what you're going to do.
Yeah, great advice. And in fact, there was a speech, I'm not sure how much people follow the RBA media, but Sarah Hunter gave a talk yesterday on demand and supply shocks and the frequency for Australia, stating that supply shocks are becoming more and more prevalent, as we've all seen over the past 5 years, and she expects that they'll pick up even more so into the future. So it's certainly something to think about in terms of the risk assessments. So thanks for that. Do you want to add anything on top of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll pass it over.
What I have seen lately is with farmers and a lot of company is the shift, and the only advice I can say is agronomic advisory, which is like you don't need to put so much of fertilizer in your soil, go for a proper advice as to how much amount of fertilizer is needed to do that. But besides that, what has happened, and I've seen the shift in the market, is that you're seeing a lot of new companies coming up with different biofertilizer space. I'm seeing a lot of experiment being done in the chicken poo space, with fertilizers, cow dung space, and also using a lot of biostimulant. I had one of the companies that recently came to me, and what they're using is they're using these so whatever is the leftover in the fire extinguisher, right? They take that because it's got some kind of ammonium sulfate. They're trying to granulate with some organics and then produce a fertilizer. Now, again, so recycling, upcycling what we currently have. And my only advice is to government is to encourage, and provide those subsidiary to those companies, who are trying to come very innovative in that space to give that nutrient back to the soil.
Okay, that's great.
There's definitely a lot of innovation that continues to happen in the ag sector, and situations like this certainly stimulate that even further. From a shock response perspective, having been in e-commerce when COVID broke out and now in the ag sector during the fert and fuel crisis, one of the things that has really stood out to me is in the business continuity plans, you don't wait for these types of situations to play out to get your playbook up to speed. Organisations definitely want to be simulating this across various scenarios in their supply chain. Who in the organisation's on point? How do industries connect? Who's got the direct line with government? And how does this play out on a cross-supply chain point of view? It's definitely something that organisations would want to be increasingly getting the playbook up to date, making sure everyone's clear on who's on point. People come and go within organisations, but how ready are companies to pivot when these types of situations unfold? Because hours are costly, days are costly, and it can take time to set these things up. And you don't want to be working out if you're ready when you need to be ready. You definitely want to be having that plan well and truly laid out prior to even hopefully ever needing it.
I think that's great advice. Risk, risk, risk. So I think it's a good time to open up to the audience for questions. I feel weird calling people audience friends, right? Who are here for questions.
Yes, if you have any questions, just raise your hand.
Are we going to run mics or how are we going to do it?
Oh yeah, the mics.
Yeah. Just for the online people. Should probably back face to them the whole time.
My question is about providing subsidies to EV, electric vehicles, would kind of reduce the shock with respect to fuel?
You want me to take that or do you want to?
Go
for it.
When you
No,
can come in wise ones.
Please.
Short answer is yes. I mean, that's on the demand side of the equation. And it's all been in the media that the surge in EV purchases, that's what this Middle East crisis has driven. Yeah, there's a lot of media reports that, Donald Trump has been the best environmentalist around because he's pushing everyone towards EV. I mean, that's a challenge for the industry as well. So going forward, need to understand that that's a threat to this business.
Just building on that question a bit further, a crisis is a great opportunity for innovation. I'm just wondering if the three of you can talk to the innovation you'd like to see and the government policy you'd like to see support that innovation to help us take advantage of this crisis and transform for the future.
Never let a good crisis go to waste. Right? Anything that helps out?
I think I did talk about it when I told you, but really similar thing, there are so much of innovation happening all across in Australia and New Zealand with organic feed and with biostimulant products. But the only problem, unfortunately, with a lot of new startups is having that funding. And some of these things take time, because if you see the whole season cycle to do trials, it takes 2 or 3 trial seasons to see if the output of the fertilizer is coming, what is expected. So you need a resilient investor, and that could be the government, or anybody else, because these days you see investors not being resilient. Everybody wants their return like right from day one, they chip in the company.
G'day, Dave Collins, Synergetics Consulting Engineers. I can't help but be worried because, this is the flavor of the month right now, today. But what about tomorrow? What about next month? What about next year? What are the other issues that we've missed? And I think fundamentally right now, it seems like politics has given priority over policies. And no one's been doing, certainly not in the public eye, the proper policy analysis. And maybe that's an opportunity for the MBS. I'm not sure if Jenny's in the room at the moment, but it's to my mind, it's an opportunity for MBS to actually provide a foundation for these sorts of, you call them risk assessments, but not just for fertilizer and fuel, but right across the Australian economy. And I think it's been missing. A case in point I would give you is if you go now to the Altona petrochemical complex in Altona, it does not exist anymore. So we used to have 8 oil refineries in Australia. We now have 2. It's blind Freddie can see that's really dumb. Now, were people asleep at the wheel? I think we need some policies here maybe to start to wake people up.
I'm not going to disagree with that. I think it was well said. And I will just say, if Jenny doesn't mind, that on maybe behalf of MBS, if I can, that we're more than open to working with people in industry and within government on various projects, if people are willing. And a lot of people here do that on a regular basis. So if you or other people do have something that you'd like to work on, then get in touch, right? Yeah, we're more than happy to jump on board.
What we're trying to do is to bring together industry groups, bring together companies, bring together people who want to work on particular projects and who want a research and a deep, both applied policy, but also some of the research thinking brought to that. And we do that in a few areas. Our centres are great places to do that. So sustainability has a lot of attention, AI has a lot of attention. We're doing that in the not-for-profit sector. But just because it's an area we don't have a centre doesn't mean we're ignoring it. And we'd always love to do that. So please approach us, please do that. We really love to engage that.
Yeah, thanks. So many questions, but I'll try and blend it into one that combines some of the questions we had already, and that is around the timelines for, I suppose, response. You've spoken about some of the innovation and that startups require a number of years to test things out, and they need the trials and they need the funding to be able to support that. If we don't have the policy in place today, then that's going to take a little bit longer to provide the support. And then on the resilience around fuel, I understand some of our 30-day fuel supply is actually offshore, or at least it was. Maybe we've used that up now. But is there an opportunity for us to use some of our neighbours to store some of our fuel in or fuel reserves? And should we be thinking a little bit, outside the box around, short-term infrastructure while we're rebuilding our own infrastructure?
Yeah, great comments. There kind of gets back to my comment earlier about the supply chains and really diversifying those. So just moving away from our standard stock supply routes from Asia, diversifying that. But to your point, it's also diversifying where our fuel is supplied as well. And can we have trans-Tasman storage opportunities, have a ring around Australia and work with our partners? There's definitely an option. Answering your question before, the 30 days, the product is either onshore in Australia or within the economic zone of Australian waters floating on ships. So that's how the inventory is calculated. But no, definitely exploring options of offshore storage as well.
in terms of Dairy Australia and the other ag research development corporations, their primary focus is on research and innovation in the ag sector, which is funded by farmers, but also significantly funded by government. And there's definitely a long-term view on research. And if you consider things like the productivity agenda that's out at the moment and has been a live agenda with research centres for decades and earlier and beyond that. So there's definitely a long-term view to research within the country, and the government funds quite significantly a lot of the research and development corporations as in order to have that future readiness and particularly the sustainability agenda as well. It also focuses very much on where there's a market failure, where it may not be attractive to industries and there may not be a short-term feasible payback. That is a real key area of focus for government to play a role in that market failure space, in which they definitely do from an agricultural perspective as well, and have done so for quite extensively for decades.
Just to build a little bit on that, so appreciate that subsidies are often the response to a shock, but I'm interested in more as your companies, we often have the long-term view, but how has those shocks changed your company's strategy around how it's doing the policy and advocacy? Because the positions typically don't change. It's just how do you position that?
It's a pretty short answer for Dairy Australia, because we are not an advocacy body, and that isn't something that we get involved in. There are industry bodies, and certainly if there are data points that help inform policy, we can absolutely participate in that. But as far as advocacy, that's out of scope for the organisation.
So in my past organisation, we have been very upfront doing those advocacies, especially in Queensland. So, and Queensland government, we have this is my personal view, seen more receptive and more hearing to what we do. So yes, like from my past experience, I can say some companies do and advocate and try to build some resilience within those supply chain.
Yeah, question from online. These are two questions. So first is from Aurora Tang. She's asking, while the Hormuz oil crisis presents economic challenges, do you see any several domestic improvements? So for example, EV adoption rates are increasing. Would the panelists be able to elaborate on any positive impacts of this at all? Like, for example, greater EV adoption. The second question is from Simon Lee, who's asking, what is the risk of Australia entering into stagflation in the next 12 months?
Yeah, I think we hit the nail on the head earlier with the subsidy question. Sorry, I hope you don't mind if I just quickly jump in. But there definitely was an uptick instantaneously with EV sales. But as we all saw, there was associated with that quite long queues, right? Because that's often what happens when we have shortages within markets. So subsidies can only get us so far, even if the government did want to come along and say, let's subsidise EVs. They could do that, but then it takes time for those vehicles to get here from overseas and that nature. So I always think in terms of, what's the what are the incentives, number one, but also what are the what's the word I'm looking for? The mechanisms through which these things can actually flow through. So we would love for the government to come along and solve all of the problems. But as I had on the slide earlier, some of these things are directly out of their control. Australia is an innovative country. We've actually, maybe a biased opinion, come up with some of the greatest innovations of all time. Wi-Fi, for example, from CSIRO. Sorry? Yeah, we're a very innovative country, and I think there's a long history of that. Google Maps, people might not know, was created in Sydney and then sold to Google. So,
MBS has to take part. Yeah. So we are the only country who is exporting gas. Google. Why other country using fertilizers? Saudi Arabia, they can't sell the gas. But something like policy is missing, like fundamentally we are wrong in terms of where we need to be. That's why I think the engagement is a big part to bring this into account.
Well, I know the Australia Institute's tried to push this through earlier this year, right? In terms of raising. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to add to you, the reason the fertilizer plants closed was because they could not keep up with the gas prices.
Yeah.
And that was the reason, but we were exporting gas.
Fundamentally wrong. I think gas prices are failing. We use the gas here, don't need to click off. Just even for $5. I think something is gone very wrong.
You're arguing against the electrification. Is that the argument?
Again, for gas, we shouldn't be short.
Thank you. My name is Johan Meyer. The question I have is around some observation that I made with super funds in Australia receiving a lot of money and finding it quite attractive to invest in offshore critical infrastructure assets like the US. So what can we do here in Australia to make it more attractive for those funds to invest in critical infrastructure to make ourselves a lot more resilient in these supply chains? Do you have any comment on that question?
Couple of things. One is subsidies will directly help with lower investment from superannuation funds or private equity. Partnerships with global oil companies as an example, because then you're linking yourself to that global market and you've got that full end-to-end system, not just the infrastructure itself. And I had another one that I just lost. It'll come to me.
I mean, as a direct beneficiary of the AI boom on my super accounts, it's tough for me to say that they shouldn't do that, but I completely understand where you're coming from, right? In that the only solution is to actually have, and people will definitely disagree with this to some extent, is an Australia first investment policy, right?
Yep.
And yeah, I mean, that's the natural solution.
And it came back to me. The hurdles to build this infrastructure, there's a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy to go through. So how could that be streamlined and policies around that as well?
The reason fertiliser manufacturing and ammonia manufacturing and petroleum refinery has left Australia is because we're a pissy little market and everything was subscale and way more expensive than global prices. So it's not necessarily the case that you have to reinstate with shitty old plants manufacturing these things. We just need to come up with agreements with the at-scale providers that are manufacturing these chemicals so that we have access to that supply. That's a first point. And then secondly, there's a bunch of technologies that are being developed in Australia. They just take a really long time. So there are 3 different Australian technology venture-backed companies that are developing new ways to make ammonia and new ways to make urea, which use renewable energy, and they're local next to the farm, and it's all fantastic, but it's an enormous premium, even over the costs now with the Straits of Hormuz closed. So those technologies need to come down the cost curve. But mandating getting great big plants, making, I think it's an $80 billion investment to make a new ammonia plant. Do we want to do that for the Australian market? It'd make too much ammonia for the Australian market. There are only 80 of them in the world. I don't think that that's necessarily the right solution. I think new technologies that can do it at smaller scale that's appropriate, but those technologies don't exist yet. And the Australian government is investing through ARENA and a bunch of other entities in developing those technologies.
Yeah, to answer this, I'll tell you that when you create a plant, right, ammonia plant, you also bringing your skill set and innovation in the country, right? And it is why I am personally saying that we should build new capacity or keep going the new capacity, is to keep that skill set in the country and then innovate more around those, because innovation also comes when you have got that particular industry. But apart from that, I give you an example is when the Brisbane plant of ammonium sulfate closed down, it was not just the urea and ammonium sulfate, but it also had so many other chemicals which were supporting the domestic other collateral industries, which were attached. It was, there were some chemicals going in the food industry, there were chemicals going in some paint industry, So just building ammonia is just the base to build a lot of things in the country, and making that in-house will help not only to create more jobs, more industries, but also that skill set which will bring innovation in that space to become more efficient.
Okay.
Jamie, what's your view on the US economy? So in terms of just how resilient the US economy has been through this crisis, inflation's at a reasonable level, earnings are growing fastest in the world, unemployment stays well. They seem to be going from strength to strength, and every other OECD nation seems to be lagging, including our own. China's pretty soft. What's your view on the next couple of years on the US economy?
I think the US is very fortunate to be benefiting from a once-in-a-lifetime AI boom, right? And they're at the forefront of that. How long that can last in terms of the subsidies that are flowing through from the present government is an open question, right? We don't know. My understanding is that a lot of these companies are bleeding money, right? Day in, day out. But we see inflated stock prices because they're just getting direct handouts. So Michael Burry's come out. Everyone familiar with Michael Burry, the guy from The Big Short who made a lot of money from the global financial crisis, who's taken a bunch of short positions against a lot of AI stocks and other stocks like Caterpillar, for example. I think if we look at the South Korean market as an example, they've already started to divest away from some of these chips in terms of AI, and their market took a mega hit, right? I can't remember the exact dollar amount. You'll have to forgive me. I think it was somewhere in the range of 500 to 600 million, billion US dollars, right? So it's a major hit. So it's uncertain is my current stance. Are you going into recession, or what's your economic growth next year? I mean, what do they say? Economists predicted, 9 out of the last 7 recessions, right? but yeah, my outlook for the future is not great. So I know, as you probably could tell from my presentation, I think the question is how long can they keep the funds running for, and also just how much can they push up innovation in the AI space, which is really keeping afloat, at least in my opinion.
Time for one more question.
Thanks very much. Tom Devitt from the Housing Industry Association. The Reserve Bank's latest forecasts have inflation getting back to normal by mid next year. Not price levels, but the rate of increase from those elevated levels back to normal. You'll know better from your own industries how these recent shocks are filtering through to your own price levels. Does that sound reasonable? Because from the housing industry's perspective, it's actually the reverse, where over the medium term, price pressures are getting worse.
Great question.
Well, it's very hard to say, but it seems to be changing daily. But there's multiple scenarios that are playing out, so I wouldn't say any of them are showing a reversal in pricing anytime soon. All the pricing that we all pay at the Bowser is based on international markers, so it's all driven by these global economics that we're working with right now.
I mean, likewise with the dairy industry and even in terms of interest rates and impact, I mean, if we want to be continuing to invest in agriculture and invest in innovation on farm, typically the financing required for that, is obviously impacted by interest rates, but then that also impacts then the return on capital and, ensuring that we remain competitive as a sector.
All right, so I think that's everything. And so thank you so much to our panelists for today. We do have a gift of appreciation for our panelists, so Jane will be bringing them out now.
Just a moment, they're a bit heavy. Careful with the bags, one.
One each, okay. Oh, great. Let me start from the back. Thank you, Pina.
Thank you. Thank you.
Send it this. On something like this. Thank you, Hitty. Michael.
Thank you, Michael, Hitty, and Pina, and Jamie, of course.
Adrian, do you want to?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Jane Enel here, who has helped us, or who actually led the organizing of this. So communicating with you. So if you might have heard from her. She's put everything together. So thank you so much, Jane. Please give her a warm round of applause. And Max as well. Thank you everyone for being here. And for those of you online, I forgot to mention earlier, we also have people from, for those of you dialing in and who are here from the Harvard Club of Victoria. We sometimes co-host events. Thank you so much for being here, for joining us. And if you do see them around, like, just welcome them. You know, we attend some of their events, they attend some of ours. So these are essentially Harvard alum who are based here. And then we do have some announcements as well, upcoming. Oh yeah, that's right. Oh, got to go to the very end. Yeah, so we do have some upcoming alumni activities. So first, the Alumni Supper Club. Oh, by the way, we printed these out. So you don't have to scan the QR codes. They're downstairs. We printed them out. Just they're on the registration table. So if you want to know more, just go down to the registration table, scan the QR code. You can also check them out at mbs.edu/events for these ones. But I guess the first one is end of July. We'll have the Alumni Supper Club. What it is it's something that essentially just a table of eight alums who want to, you know, if you want to meet the rest of the alumni community, we put you in a table of 8 alumni whom you might not otherwise meet. So people from a different year or, a different background, just, make some new friends. So we'll curate it. So it's an expression of interest. We'll curate it, and then we'll put you in a table with other alums and, maybe meet some new people. So this was started by Jessica, who is here, Jessica Cheney. So thank you so much for doing that. So we've got tables in South Yarra, Melbourne CBD, and Fitzroy. This is like the 3rd time we're running it. And then we have happy hour. That's in the 6th of August. So we provide the food. You come here, and then we'll, drinks available for purchase at the bar. Just hang out. We've got students. It's open to students, alumni, and staff, and really anyone. So just come. It's on Thursday, the 6th of August. And then our Women's Alumni Network would have a partnership event with the Women in Management Club. It's called Money Moves Big Life Decisions. That's on Wednesday, the 12th of August, 5:30 p.m., and it's in person. And also, of course, Alumni Day and Reunion Dinner. The 30th of October, you might have seen the announcement. So it's online and in person. It's practically the whole day. Women in Leadership Dinner, that's on Thursday, the 26th of November. So save the date. Go to mbs.edu/events. It is there. There are discounts for alumni, special price for alumni. And finally, help us make this evening better. Please take 1 minute to share your feedback. It's just 3 questions. You can scan it downstairs. Thank you. So this would help us improve events like these in the future. So we really value this feedback from you. By the way, you might have seen the executive education slide, the short courses slides that we have earlier. If you want to find out more about the short courses that we have on offer, Anne Rainey is here. Please approach her and ask her, so things like executive presence and storytelling. I really enjoyed that that short course. That's, I think, one of our most popular ones. And I think we're incorporating some of that in the MBA from what I hear. So if you want to learn more about that, Anne is a person to talk to. And please, there's refreshments downstairs at the hub. We are, so there's food and refreshments, and we're running a cash bar tonight. So, essentially drinks are available for purchase at the bar. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
What was your question? Hand up, but you get a basket.